It started with a mop bucket and a memory. Jessica Monroe had been working as a cleaner at the Emerson Hotel in downtown Chicago for almost 6 years. Most days were the same. Room after room, bed after bed, silence broken only by the hum of the vacuum or the occasional thank you that never quite reached eye level. No one really noticed Jessica, and truth be told, she was fine with that, because behind the quiet, she was holding on to something no one there would ever guess. Every morning before her shift, she'd spend 20 minutes in the tiny break room watching Mandarin news on her cracked tablet. Not because she had to, but because her mother once dreamed of seeing the world. China had been at the top of her list. She never made it. Cancer took her before either of them could afford plane tickets. So Jessica made a promise at her mother's bedside. If you can't go, I will, and I'll learn the language for both of us. She didn't tell anyone, not even the other cleaners she took lunch with. Not even the supervisor who mispronounced her name every week. The only person who knew was Henry, the night security guard with a slow walk and sharp eyes. He once caught her practicing tones in the stairwell and never said a word, just nodded like he understood. And maybe he did. You know, he told her one evening while sipping lukewarm coffee, one day someone's going to need that voice of yours, you just wait. Jessica had smiled politely, but deep down, she didn't believe it. People like her didn't get called into meetings. They got told to wipe fingerprints off conference doors. So when she clocked in that morning and saw her assignment, 14th floor, executive suites, she assumed it was a mistake, or worse, a setup. Chloe, her manager, never sent her up there. That floor was for VIPs. Cleaners were expected to stay invisible, especially ones with scuffed sneakers and second-hand uniforms. Still, Jessica grabbed her cart and pressed the elevator button. The ride up felt longer than usual. Somewhere between the 10th and 12th floor, she whispered a few phrases under her breath. She wasn't sure why. Just muscle memory, maybe. Or maybe something in her gut knew that today wouldn't be like the others. Not even close. The 14th floor always smelled like something expensive. Jasmine-scented polish, fresh orchids, and that faint trace of cigar smoke no amount of air freshener could hide. Jessica pushed her cart out of the elevator, careful not to bump the gold-trim walls. She kept her head down and moved quickly. Up here, time didn't stretch. It was counted in scheduled meetings and catered lunches. Room 1407 was her first stop. She knocked once, gently, just in case, then unlocked the door with her passkey. The suite was empty. A half-finished cup of tea on the table, a briefcase still zipped tight on the armchair. She worked fast, used to being where she shouldn't be and leaving no trace behind. But just as she was smoothing out the duvet, she heard voices. Not from the hallway, from the room next door. Thin walls weren't common on the lower floors, but here, even silence travelled. She paused, hand frozen on the pillow. I don't care what he said. We can't finalise the deal without a proper interpreter. The voice was sharp, impatient, a man's voice, deep, American. Then came another, softer, a Chinese accent, deliberate and clipped. Jessica couldn't make out every word, but she didn't need to. She recognised the tone. Misunderstanding layered with frustration. One side trying to explain, the other trying to save face. She inched closer to the adjoining wall. Not to eavesdrop, not intentionally, but because something about it pulled her in. She understood. Every stutter, every pause, every wrong translation she imagined being made by some nervous assistant down the hall. She bit her lip. This wasn't her place. She wasn't staff in a suit. She wasn't someone with a badge that opened doors to meetings. She was the girl who cleaned up after them. Still, she stayed a moment longer. There's no one available who speaks both fluently, the man snapped. And we've already delayed this once. Jessica's stomach tightened. Her hands began to sweat. Her heart, though, it beat just a little louder. Because she could speak both. Fluently, smoothly, with the respect the conversation deserved. But stepping in would mean revealing everything. The years she spent studying behind closed doors. The promise to her mother. The voice she kept tucked away like something too precious to touch. And what if they laughed? What if they told her to get back to scrubbing sinks? Her mind ran wild with excuses to walk away. She grabbed her cart and headed for the door. Then she heard something else. This whole deal's about trust, and if we can't even communicate properly, we might as well pack up. There was silence after that. A silence so heavy it followed her into the hallway. Jessica stood there staring at the elevator. And then, instead of pressing the button, she turned. She didn't knock. She didn't wait. She walked back down that hallway, her hands trembling, her voice trapped somewhere between her throat and her courage. This wasn't just about a deal. This was the moment Henry had told her about. She just didn't know yet if she was brave enough to open her mouth. Jessica stood outside the conference room, one hand resting on the cleaning cart, like it was the only thing keeping her upright. Through the glass wall, she could see them. 3 suited men sitting stiffly around a long table. One of them flipping through pages with a kind of practiced frustration. The air inside looked thick, tense. She could hear bits of it now. The American executive was pacing. "I said clarify, not simplify. That's not the same thing." Jessica closed her eyes. She could feel her pulse in her ears, her fingers, her throat. This wasn't her place. She knew that. She was wearing sneakers with frayed laces and a name badge that didn't carry weight. There were rules, and she was about to break them all. But in the middle of that thought, Henry's voice came back quiet and steady in her memory. "One day, someone's going to need that voice of yours." She looked down at her hands. They were still shaking, but she took one breath, stepped forward, and pushed open the conference room door. All 3 men turned. The silence that followed wasn't just surprise, it was confusion. Like she'd walked onto a stage she had no business being on. "Can I help you?" one of the assistants asked, standing halfway out of his seat. Jessica's voice caught for a second. Her instincts screamed to back away. But she didn't. I couldn't help overhearing," she began, her voice soft but steady. "I speak Mandarin. I just thought maybe I could help." The American executive blinked. She recognized him now, Adrian Miles, founder of Miles Industries, the man whose name was on the gold plaque by the elevator. He looked her up and down. She waited for it. That flash of dismissal, the polite no thank you, the sideways smile that said, "Go back to your cart." But it didn't come. Instead, Adrian looked at the translator, then back at Jessica. "You speak Mandarin?" he asked carefully. Jessica nodded. "Fluently?" The man across the table, the Chinese representative, tilted his head slightly, curious now. "Where did you study?" he asked in Mandarin. Jessica's eyes softened. Her accent when she replied was smooth, almost melodic. "I didn't study at a university. I learned on my own, at home, in honour of my mother." A pause. Then something shifted in the room. The Chinese delegate smiled, for the first time since the meeting started. Adrian leaned forward slowly. "All right," he said, "and let's see what you've got." Jessica stepped in, carefully moving past the edge of the table. She didn't sit, she didn't need to. She just stood there, between 2 languages, 2 cultures, and for the first time, between who she was and who she could become. And as she opened her mouth to translate, Jessica Monroe wasn't just a cleaner anymore. She was exactly where she was meant to be. The words flowed out of her mouth before she even realised she'd found her rhythm. Jessica translated sentence after sentence, switching seamlessly between English and Mandarin like she'd been doing it her whole life. And maybe, in a way, she had, not for boardrooms or business deals, but for herself, for her mum, for the quiet promise she'd kept for years, whispered over dishwater and dusty books. Inside that glass-walled conference room, time seemed to pause. Adrian watched her closely, his pen hovering above a notepad he'd stopped writing on. The Chinese delegate leaned forward now, nodding slowly, responding in smoother, fuller sentences. Jessica kept pace without flinching, never needing to ask for clarification. She didn't just understand the words. She understood the weight behind them, the tone, the nuance. That was something no textbook could teach. When the conversation hit a tense point, a clause about long-term licensing, Jessica didn't just repeat it flat. She softened the edges, used cultural cues to reframe it respectfully. The delegate's face eased. Adrian raised an eyebrow. By the end of the meeting, the men were laughing. Actual laughter. A handshake was exchanged, papers were signed. The tension from earlier? Gone, like it had never existed. Jessica stood off to the side, hands folded, heart thudding so loudly she was sure someone would hear it. But what she didn't expect was what came next. The Chinese businessman stood and turned to her. "You speak with respect," he said, still in Mandarin. "Not just with language, but with heart, that matters." She bowed her head slightly, too stunned to speak. Adrian looked at her then, really looked at her, like she was someone brand new. "You just saved that deal," he said quietly, almost to himself. Then louder, "What's your name?" Jessica Monroe." He nodded. "Jessica, remind me to thank whoever assigned you to the 14th floor." She smiled almost shyly. That might have been a mistake. Adrian gave a short laugh, shook his head. If it was the best mistake this company's made in months. He glanced down at her uniform, at the badge clipped to her chest. There was something in his eyes, not pity, not surprise. Recognition. "Do you work here full-time?" he asked. Jessica hesitated, unsure what he meant. "Yes, on the cleaning staff." Adrian looked at his assistant. "Get her information, all of it, and someone make sure she's not scheduled for the rest of the day." Jessica blinked. "Did I do something wrong?" He turned to her, smiling now. "No, you did something very right." And just like that, the room that hadn't even known her name 30 minutes ago was now watching her like she mattered. She didn't quite know what to do with that feeling, but she held on to it just the same. By the time Jessica stepped back onto the staff floor, the world felt different. It looked the same beige walls, same flickering light above the vending machines. But people's eyes lingered now. Conversations paused when she walked by. A few glanced at her badge, then at her face, as if suddenly realizing the name actually belonged to someone worth remembering. She kept her head down, heart still racing. She wasn't used to attention, especially not this kind. Henry found her near the back service hallway where she'd gone to catch her breath. He leaned against the wall like he always did, hands tucked into his jacket pockets, looking like he'd been waiting there for hours, even though he'd just arrived. "You did it," he said simply. Jessica tried to smile, but it wobbled. "I don't even know what I did," he chuckled. "You walked into a room you weren't invited to and changed the entire tone of the place. That's not nothing." She looked at him, unsure. "Do you think I crossed a line?" Henry tilted his head. "Maybe, but sometimes the line needs crossing." Before she could respond, the staff radio on her hip buzzed. "Jessica Monroe, please report to the management office." Her stomach dropped. She'd never been called up there before. When she arrived, the door was already open. Inside, Chloe sat behind her desk, arms crossed. Her tone was tight. "Jessica, come in." Jessica stepped in slowly, careful not to make eye contact right away. "I heard about what happened this morning," Chloe said, flipping through a folder like she wasn't really reading it. "Quite the scene." "I didn't mean to cause trouble," Jessica said quickly. "I just thought I could help." Chloe's lips curved, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. "Help is fine, but we have procedures, chain of command. You don't just walk into executive meetings uninvited." Jessica swallowed hard. "I understand." There was a pause. Then Chloe set the folder down. "That being said, Mr. Miles requested your file." Jessica's breath caught. Chloe continued, her voice cool. "Apparently he wants to speak with you again. Something about a role, possibly translation related." Jessica didn't know what to say. She waited for the other shoe to drop, and it did. "I'll be honest, Jessica, those types of positions require experience, professional polish, not just language skills." Jessica felt her cheeks burn. She didn't argue. She'd heard versions of this before. Chloe stood, walking around the desk. "I know you mean well, but not every moment needs a hero." And then, with the kind of sweetness that stung more than it soothed, she added, "Just be careful you don't fly too close to the sun." Jessica nodded politely, thanked her, and left the office. But as she walked down the hall, Chloe's words echoed in her mind. She wasn't trying to be a hero. She had simply seen a problem, and for the first time in her life had the tools to solve it. Wasn't that what anyone would do? Still, doubt clung to her like dust on old curtains, until she reached the lobby, and saw Adrian Miles standing there, waiting for her, smiling like he already knew the answer to the question he was about to ask. Adrian didn't wait for her to speak. The moment Jessica approached, he held out his hand like they were old colleagues, not strangers separated by elevator buttons and job titles. "I'm glad you came," he said. "I wasn't sure if Chloe passed the message along." "She did," Jessica replied softly. Adrian gave a short nod, reading her expression like it was part of the morning briefing. "Let me guess." She made it sound like a warning, not an invitation. Jessica gave a tiny smile. He wasn't wrong. "Look," Adrian said, motioning for her to follow him toward the hotel cafe. "I'll be straight with you. I don't usually pull staff off their jobs in the middle of the day, but I've been thinking about that meeting all morning and I realised something." Jessica followed slowly, hands clasped in front of her. "You didn't just translate," he continued. "You diffused tension, built trust, and got us through a conversation that was heading straight for disaster. I've had professional interpreters who couldn't manage that." They sat at a small table near the window. Jessica didn't touch the water they brought. Her fingers curled around the edge of her napkin instead. Adrian leaned forward, elbows on the table. "I want you to join my team," he said simply. "Not as a cleaner, As a cultural liaison, we've got another round of talks coming up in Shanghai. I could use someone who actually understands both the language and the people behind it." Jessica's eyes widened. "Shanghai?" He nodded. "Expenses covered, visa arranged, training included. You'll have someone from my staff guiding you through everything." She didn't answer right away, because her mind wasn't in that cafe anymore. It was back in her apartment, where her mother's photograph sat framed next to a candle that hadn't been lit in months. It was in the hallway outside that conference room, where her hands had shaken like they'd never stop. It was back in every moment she'd convinced herself that her dream was too far, too fragile. "I don't have a degree," she said quietly. "I've never been on a plane." Adrian shrugged. "We'll take it one step at a time." Jessica hesitated. "I'm not polished. I don't know how to act in those rooms." Adrian gave a half smile. "Neither do half the people in those rooms. The difference is you actually listen." She laughed, soft and disbelieving, but it felt good. Then Adrian's tone shifted, just enough to land with weight. "There's always going to be someone who thinks you don't belong, especially when you surprise them. But I don't build teams based on comfort zones, I build them based on what's real." He slid a card across the table. Jessica stared at it. Her name, handwritten in neat, bold letters, sat right above a temporary job title, Liaison Trainee. "I don't expect a yes right now," he added. "Take a day, think about it, but don't talk yourself out of something just because it doesn't look like what you imagined." Jessica looked up. He meant it, every word. And for the first time, the question wasn't whether she was good enough. It was whether she was ready to stop hiding it. Jessica didn't say yes that afternoon. She went home instead, took the long way, past the park her mother used to walk through on her better days, past the corner store where the cashier still asked about her dad even though he'd been gone for years. She sat in her tiny studio apartment, staring at the business card Adrian had given her. It was creased now, from being held and turned over so many times. Her name still looked strange written next to a title, like it didn't belong. But neither did she, not completely, in her old world anymore. The next morning, she didn't go back to cleaning rooms. She reported to the 20th floor, just like the card instructed. Adrian's chief of staff, a woman named Tessa, met her with a clipboard, a firm handshake, and a pace that felt 3 steps too fast for Jessica's nerves. "Business etiquette training starts at 10, Tessa said briskly. "You'll shadow our translator this afternoon, and tomorrow Adrian wants you to sit in on prep for the Shanghai visit." Jessica nodded, even though half of that terrified her. She was wearing the nicest blouse she owned, one her mum had bought her during a clearance sale, saying it made her look like someone going somewhere. The sleeves were too short now, but she wore it anyway. Every hallway felt louder, every eye that passed over her felt sharper. She didn't know where to put her hands. During lunch, she sat alone in the staff cafe. No one was rude, but they weren't warm either. She was in a strange in-between, not quite housekeeping, not yet executive. The same people who used to walk past her without a glance now looked at her with quiet curiosity, or worse, confusion. By late afternoon, she'd memorised 4 different ways to bow respectfully, 5 hand gestures that were considered impolite in different parts of Asia, and how to handle a toast without offending anyone. It was a lot. She found herself in the stairwell again, just like she used to. Except this time she wasn't practicing pronunciation. She was breathing through the fear. Henry found her there. He didn't say anything at first, just sat down beside her, handing her a warm paper cup of chamomile tea from the vending machine. "I heard," he said eventually, "you're heading to Shanghai." Jessica gave a tiny nod. Henry smiled gently. "You know, most people think courage feels like standing tall." He looked at her. "But really, it feels like sitting here, scared out of your mind, doing it anyway." She laughed softly, a tear slipping down without permission. "I don't know if I belong up there," she whispered. Henry leaned back. "Then make them question why they ever thought you didn't." The tea was too hot, but she drank it anyway, because something about that burn reminded her she was still here, still trying, still rising. Jessica had never been on a plane before. She'd watched them from the ground plenty of times, the way they climbed, cut across clouds, disappeared. But now she was inside one, somewhere over the Pacific, with a passport so new it still smelled like fresh ink, and a seatmate who fell asleep with his mouth open. She didn't sleep. Instead, she kept her hands folded over the small leather notebook she always carried. It had her notes, all the words she'd practiced, the etiquette reminders Tessa had drilled into her, and a few pages her mother had once scribbled poems on. She read them over and over like prayers. When they landed in Shanghai, the city hit her all at once. The lights, the pace, the language spilling around her like a river she'd only ever practiced wading into from the safety of a screen. But now it was real. Tessa didn't give her time to be overwhelmed. There were cars waiting, schedules printed in both English and Mandarin, a translator badge clipped onto her blazer before her second breath. "Stay close," Tessa said, "and stay sharp." Jessica did both. That week was a blur of meetings, banquets, late-night debriefs, and early morning prep. She sat in on negotiations where the air felt too thin to breathe, passed notes when someone misunderstood a term, smoothed awkward pauses with a well-placed cultural reference. She never overstepped, but she never disappeared either. People began to notice. At one dinner, a senior executive from the Chinese delegation raised a glass and nodded to her. "You translate more than words," he said in Mandarin. "You translate people." Jessica smiled, quietly stunned. But not everyone was smiling. Chloe was there too, flown in to oversee the hospitality logistics. And while her tone remained professional, her eyes said otherwise. She stood too close during introductions. She corrected Jessica once, publicly, on a pronunciation that wasn't actually wrong. Jessica didn't react. Not then. Later, alone in her hotel room, she sat on the edge of the bed and stared out at the skyline. She didn't feel victorious. She felt like she was walking a tightrope, 1 inch at a time, with everyone watching, waiting to see if she'd fall. She missed her mum, missed the smell of cinnamon toast in the mornings, missed the warmth of knowing someone back home believed in her without needing a resume. She called Henry. Just hearing his gravelly voice steadied her. "Still breathing?" he asked. "Barely." "That's how you know it matters." Jessica laughed, and somewhere in that laugh she realised she wasn't just surviving. She was changing, not into someone new, but into the person she'd always quietly hoped she could be. The next morning, when she walked into the final negotiation meeting, she didn't linger by the door. She walked in like she belonged, because maybe she finally believed it. The flight back to Chicago felt different. Jessica sat by the window, watching the sky change colours. It didn't feel like she was returning to where she started. It felt like she was landing somewhere new, even if the zip code hadn't changed. When she stepped back into the Emerson Hotel, the front desk staff did a double take. The same doorman who used to nod without making eye contact opened the door a little wider this time. One of the receptionists, the one who used to forget her name, called out, "Welcome back, Miss Monroe!" She almost turned around. Miss Monroe, not Jessica, not the cleaner, not invisible. It was surreal. Henry was waiting by the elevator. Of course he was. Same coffee cup, same slow smile. "You didn't get lost out there," he said. Jessica smiled. Almost. They rode the elevator together, but not in silence this time. "I saw the article," he added. "Miles Industries closed that deal. Big win." Jessica shrugged. "It wasn't just me." Henry looked sideways. "But it couldn't have happened without you. That's something." She nodded, quietly letting the truth of that settle in. Later that week, Adrian asked her to speak at a staff gathering. Something casual, just hotel employees and executives. Jessica almost said no. Public speaking wasn't her thing. Being the centre of attention still felt strange. But then she remembered all the times she stayed quiet, all the years she let her voice shrink. So she said yes. The room was full. Some people came out of curiosity, others out of support. Even Chloe showed up, though she stood in the back with her arms crossed like she didn't plan to clap. Jessica stepped up to the microphone with shaky hands and a note card she didn't end up reading. She just spoke. "I used to clean these rooms every day, and for a long time I believed that was all I'd ever be. Not because it was a bad job, but because I didn't think anyone saw me beyond it." She paused. The room was still. "But I had this voice, this skill, and I kept it hidden, like something fragile. It wasn't until the right moment, the scariest moment, that I let anyone hear it." She looked around the room. "I didn't save a business deal that day. I saved something in myself. The belief that I mattered, that I had something worth saying, and if I hadn't spoken up, I might still be scrubbing baseboards and dreaming in silence." When she finished, the room stood. Not everyone, but enough. Adrian clapped the longest. Afterward, a man in a pressed suit approached her, Mr. Young, a representative from the Chinese delegation, in town for another meeting. He shook her hand and said, "You are a bridge. People forget how important those are." Jessica nodded, feeling the words settle deep. That night, back in the break room where it all began, she found her old notebook tucked in her locker. Inside, a note, Henry's handwriting. "Your voice is a door. Keep opening it." She closed the locker slowly, heart full. And for the first time, she didn't feel like she was returning to anything. She felt like she was stepping forward. The next few months moved like a slow sunrise. Jessica wasn't just the new girl on the executive team anymore. She became a quiet presence in rooms that used to overlook her, not because she demanded attention, but because people began listening when she spoke. She still kept that same notebook in her bag, still rode the train to work, still bought her coffee from the corner cart where the owner called her boss lady now, half joking but somehow still sincere. One afternoon, Adrian stopped her in the hallway. "I've been thinking," he said. "We've got interns coming in next month, college students, young translators, some pretty sharp kids." Jessica waited, unsure where this was going. "I want you to mentor one or two of them, show them what it looks like to navigate between cultures, not just translate them." Jessica blinked. "Me?" Adrian smiled. "Why not you?" She didn't have a good answer, because maybe there wasn't one anymore. That week, she gave a small talk in the conference room. Just 10 minutes. 2 interns, a coordinator, and Tessa sat in the back. Jessica stood by the whiteboard, no slides, no fancy speech. "I used to work downstairs," she began. "Literally, cleaning rooms, scrubbing floors, folding towels with the corners tucked just right." The interns watched her carefully. "And for a long time, I thought that was all people saw when they looked at me. But I had this thing, this gift, that didn't fit my uniform. I kept it quiet, safe." She looked up, until one day I didn't. One of the interns raised her hand. "Weren't you scared?" Jessica smiled. "Completely." She laughed a little. "But I was more scared of staying invisible forever." After the session, one of them lingered, a shy young woman named Lynn. "My mum's from China," she said. "She used to say we speak 2 languages, but we belong in neither." Jessica nodded. "Maybe that just means we get to create something new." She meant it. A week later, she got a letter in the mail. No return address, just handwriting she hadn't seen in a long time. Henry had retired quietly the month before. No party, no fuss. Inside the envelope was a photograph. Jessica standing at the front of the conference room, speaking, her hands mid-gesture, eyes bright with something real. And below it on the back, written in his careful script, "You were never invisible. You were just waiting for the world to look up." Jessica sat with that for a long time. She thought of her mother, of whispered promises, of words that once felt too heavy for her mouth. She thought of every person scrubbing sinks, answering phones, shelving books, carrying brilliance the world hadn't noticed yet. And then she picked up her pen, opened a blank page in her notebook and wrote, "To the girl still hiding her voice, one day it will be the one that changes everything. Keep going." She closed the book and kept going. If you've made it all the way here, thank you, really. This story means a lot to me. And I hope in some small way it meant something to you too. Maybe it reminded you of someone, maybe it reminded you of yourself. And hey, I'd love to know, do you think the female voice suits this story, or would you rather hear it in a gentle male voice next time? If it were me listening late at night, I think I'd still go with a soft, calm female voice. Something about it feels warm, like a quiet hug. But I'm curious what you prefer. Let me know, okay? I can always adjust it for next time. If you enjoyed this little corner of calm, feel free to hit subscribe. It really helps. Thank you so much for choosing to spend your time here with me. Take care, and I'll see you in the next bedtime story. Good night.